It's somewhere between 2 and 4 a.m. You were asleep, and then suddenly, completely, you weren't. Heart already going, mind already moving. And the first thought isn't, I'll get back to sleep, it's, here we go again. Maybe you lie there running the calculation. How many hours left if you fall back asleep right now? Maybe you reach for your phone without meaning to. Maybe you just stare at the ceiling, waiting for the feeling to pass, knowing from experience that it probably won't pass quickly. This video is about why that happens. Not in a general way. In a specific way. Specific enough that the next time it happens, something will be different. Not the body, the interpretation. And that difference matters more than it sounds. So let's start with what's actually happening in your body when this occurs. Here's the first thing to understand, and this part is actually reassuring once it lands correctly. Every person who sleeps goes through this. Not the anxiety part, the waking part. Sleep isn't a continuous state. It's a cycle, roughly 90 minutes long, that moves through different stages: light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, and then a brief transition back toward waking before the cycle starts again. During those transitions, the brain surfaces. Not fully, not consciously for most people. But there's a moment of reduced depth, a microarousal, where the body briefly checks its environment before cycling back down. Most people don't remember these moments. They happen, the brain finds nothing threatening, and sleep resumes without the person ever knowing. That process happens 4 to 6 times a night for every sleeping person. Every night. It is not a sign that something is wrong. It is the architecture of normal human sleep. So if everyone has these microarousals, why are some people back asleep in seconds? And others sitting up with a racing heart, calculating how many hours until the alarm? That's the question this video is actually answering. And the answer is not what most sleep content says it is. The waking isn't the problem. What the nervous system does in the first 2 seconds after waking, that's what changed. Now let's talk about what anxiety does to this process and why it creates such a persistent pattern. Research on insomnia consistently points to something called hyperarousal, a state where the nervous system is running at a higher baseline level of alert than it needs to be, even during sleep. In people with anxiety-driven insomnia, this baseline is elevated before sleep begins. The nervous system doesn't fully power down at night the way it does in someone without this pattern. It stays partially on watch, which means when the natural microarousal comes, that normal surfacing between sleep cycles, the nervous system is already primed. It's already scanning. And instead of finding nothing and cycling back down, it finds the arousal itself. The slight increase in heart rate, the brief moment of disorientation, the quiet of the room. And here is where the conditioned response comes in. At some point, often after a period of sustained stress or a stretch of difficult nights, or a single night that was frightening enough to register, the nervous system made a connection. Waking at night equals threat. That half-conscious moment of surfacing equals something to be afraid of. Not because you decided that, not because you believe it logically, but because the nervous system ran the association enough times that it became automatic. Now, every time you surface during a sleep cycle, the nervous system checks and finds its own arousal and treats that arousal as confirmation that something is wrong, which creates more arousal, which wakes you more fully, which confirms the threat signal, which makes the heart rate climb. That is the loop. Not a character flaw, not fragility, a conditioned response that your nervous system practiced until it became a reflex. Your nervous system learned this. And a response that was learned is, by definition, a response that can be unlearned. That's not a motivational statement. That's just how conditioning works, in both directions. Which brings us to something most people don't realize. Almost everything you're doing to try to fall back asleep is actually reinforcing the pattern. This is the part that most sleep content skips, because it requires saying something that sounds counterintuitive and that most wellness advice quietly contradicts. Almost everything you do in the first 2 minutes after a 3 a.m. wake-up is probably making the next one more likely. Not because you're doing it wrong, because no one explained what the nervous system is actually responding to. When you check the clock and immediately calculate how many hours remain before you have to be functional, your nervous system receives a message, not in words. In chemistry, the message is, we are assessing a situation. There is something here that requires evaluation. That is a threat signal. when you lie completely still, trying to force yourself back to sleep through sheer stillness, monitoring your own breathing, checking whether the heart rate is dropping, waiting, your nervous system receives another message. We are on watch. Something needs to be monitored. That is also a threat signal. When you reach for your phone, not to do anything, just for something familiar, the light hits the retina, cortisol nudges upward, and the nervous system receives confirmation. The external world is accessible. We are not resting. We are available. Threat signal. When you Google, "Why do I keep waking up at 3 a.m. with anxiety?" which you may be doing right now, which is completely understandable, the nervous system is not reading the search results. It is noting that at 3 a.m., the body mobilized, reached for information, and activated. Threat signal. None of this is your fault. Every one of those responses is logical. The clock check makes sense. The stillness makes sense. The phone makes sense. What doesn't make sense, and this is the part no one explains clearly, is that the nervous system isn't responding to the logic. It's responding to the activation level of the body. If the body is mobilized, the nervous system interprets that as evidence of threat. It doesn't matter why the body is mobilized. It doesn't matter that you know, rationally, that you're safe. The system is running below the level of rational override. That was never about weakness. This is why the standard advice, just breathe, think calming thoughts, tell yourself you'll be fine, fails at 3 a.m. for an anxious nervous system. Those instructions require a prefrontal cortex that is online and available. At 3 a.m., in a hyperarousal state, the prefrontal cortex is not running the show. The instructions reach the brain. But the part of the brain that could execute them has stepped back. And the part of the brain that's actually in charge right now, the part running threat detection, doesn't respond to reasoning. It responds to signals, which means the only thing that interrupts a 3 a.m. activation cycle is a signal the nervous system can receive and interpret as, the threat has passed, not a thought, a signal. If you're watching this at 3 a.m. or building a plan for the next time it happens, there's a resource in the description called the Hard Night Survival Kit. It's a set of micro-tools, breath patterns, body anchors, and specific prompts selected because they work at the signal level, not the reasoning level. For the nights when the thinking brain isn't available. Link is in the description and the pinned comment. So let me give you something practical you can use the next time this happens. So what does a signal look like in practice at 3 a.m. when the heart is still going? It starts with understanding one thing. The goal is not to fall back asleep. The goal is to stop sending threat signals. Sleep will follow, or it won't, on a given night. But the more urgently you pursue sleep, the more threat signals you generate, because urgency is activation, and activation is the message the nervous system is reading. The first thing that works differently. Stop orienting towards sleep. Don't try to get back to sleep. Let the body be awake. Without the layer of urgency about being awake, this sounds passive. It isn't. It's an active redirection. From "I need to fix this" to "I can be here while this passes." That redirection sends a different signal. No action required. Nothing to solve. The situation is tolerable. The second thing, give the nervous system a low-demand anchor. Not a breathing exercise that requires counting. Not a body scan that requires concentration. Something simple enough to do with a half-online brain. One option, place one hand on the chest, one on the stomach. Notice which hand moves when you breathe. That's it. Not a technique. Just an observation. The nervous system reads this as, the body is in contact with itself. Attention has narrowed. Nothing external requires monitoring. That is not a threat signal. That is a safety signal. You don't need to feel calm for this to work. You don't need to believe it will work. The signal gets sent regardless of whether you believe it. This is not a willpower problem. The third thing, and this one matters for the nights when it doesn't resolve quickly. Lower the cost of the wake-up. The amount of suffering produced by a 3 a.m. wake-up is not fixed. Most of it comes from the layer on top of the wake-up. The calculation, the dread, the interpretation. A person who wakes at 3 a.m. and thinks there's that normal sleep transition, my nervous system is still learning, loses far less of the night than a person who wakes and immediately begins calculating, catastrophizing, and fighting. Same wake-up, completely different nervous system response, and over time, completely different outcomes. This is slow work. It doesn't happen in one night. Some nights the tools land and the activation drops. Some nights nothing works and you watch the ceiling until morning. Neither of those nights is failure. They are both information about where the nervous system currently is. And information is the beginning of change, not the end of it. If tonight is one of the hard ones and you want tools you can actually use in the dark, the Hard Night Survival Kit is in the description and pinned comment. It's built for exactly this state. What does your 3 a.m. usually look like? Is it the racing heart, the calculation, the phone, something else? Drop it in the comments. Knowing you're not alone in the specific details matters more than it sounds. Here's what's true about that moment when you wake up and the heart is already going. It was never a sign that something is fundamentally wrong with you. It was never evidence that your nervous system is more broken than other people's. It was never proof that sleep is something you can't have. It was a micro-arousal, a completely normal event in the architecture of human sleep, caught by a nervous system that learned under real pressure to treat that moment as a threat. The learning was reasonable. The conditions that produced it were real. And the response made sense given what the nervous system knew. What changes isn't the wake-up. Micro-arousals will keep happening. They happen for everyone, every night for a lifetime. What changes is what the nervous system does in the first 2 seconds after. Whether it finds a threat signal or a safety signal, whether it cycles back down or mobilizes, that response was learned. Which means it is learnable in the other direction. Not tonight, maybe. Not through trying harder, or being more disciplined, or finally finding the right technique at the right moment. Through repetition of a different signal. Small, low stakes, available even when the thinking brain has stepped back. The next time it happens, and it may happen again before things start to shift, you'll know something you didn't know before. You'll know the wake-up itself is not the problem. You'll know the racing heart is a conditioned response, not a verdict. You'll know what the nervous system is actually listening for. And even if none of that stops the activation in the moment, even if the heart keeps going and the mind keeps moving, something underneath will be different. The case you've been building against yourself gets one piece of evidence removed. That's not a small thing. That's where the unlearning begins.